Hi, welcome to LonghausTV. You're on the Research Channel. This is Scott Stewart, and today my guest is Bill Singleton from Hynes Lawyers. Bill, we know that cloud computing is changing the way that enterprise ICT is operating today. There's just so much disruption going on. And today we wanted to talk about contracts and the legal frameworks and how cloud computing is disrupting that space. Perhaps you could give us some insights on what you're seeing is happening out there in CIO space in relation to how cloud is disrupting that.
Well, sure, Scott. I suppose one of the major issues that we're facing is that CIOs now have to deal with cloud contracts as opposed to what we used to call on-premise contracts, which means that really they've got to do a lot more due diligence, they've got to look into things a lot more, and they've got to basically understand the nature of the cloud.
Are we finding that that cloud, is it being well catered for in relation to the existing legal frameworks that are out there?
Well, that's a good question, Scott, and I suppose we're looking at a real major paradigm shift in the way that services are delivered. And as I'm sure we'll talk about a bit later, there's a lot of hype around that. Really, I suppose one of the major things that CIOs are now having to do, which they possibly didn't have to do before, was look at the type of services that they're going to move to the cloud, as opposed to wholesale moving them to the cloud.
Yeah, so from my personal experience as a CIO, when we were implementing a cloud strategy, I noticed that a lot of the clauses, that in the agreement were actually just straight out of a managed service, and they didn't really fit well with the sort of things that we were really after as a business. So, is it a case that the vendors aren't investing?
I think in the rush to get cloud services out there, maybe it's tempting for a vendor to just try to adapt an outsourcing contract or an on-premise contract and call it a cloud contract, which increases the risk. So it really has become incumbent upon CIOs to actually have a look into those contracts and maybe seek some advice. Otherwise, they're using something which is not fit for the purpose for which it's being used.
Do you think also that part of this, the reason for this is because that something that we call cloud washing, where there's a lot of managed service providers, a lot of hosting, a lot of existing sort of service products or offerings are being simply rebadged as cloud, and hence this is creating a lot of confusion in that space and trying to work out what actually is cloud and does it really matter, and is this part of the reason is that it is actually managed services under the guise of a cloud wash service?
Yes, in certain circumstances that's definitely the case, and we advise our clients, and I speak to clients regularly who are presented with services contracts dressed up as cloud contracts. So I guess the question is, number one, does it matter? Number two, is that really what you're looking for? And if it is, then clearly that you need to ask whether that's the appropriate contract to use in that particular case.
And what are you finding the key things that are emerging, that, perhaps new things or things that are a little bit more important now, given the nature of cloud service delivery?
I think that's a very good question as well, Scott, and I think we've got to move back a bit before we have a discussion about what's new contractually, to look at the role of the CIO in terms of determining whether to put a particular application into the cloud or not. So the whole thing really is dependent upon how critical your application is. For a supercritical application, you would then need to do a very specific due diligence exercise on whether I should put that into the cloud. For a not so critical application, less due diligence is required and less risk will be, you'll face less risk putting that application into the cloud. So given that, then the terms and conditions are different for a cloud contract, but the question is, what is your risk? So for one of those high-risk critical systems, you would then need a completely new set of terms and conditions, which basically don't exist at the moment. And that's where you need people, specialist lawyers, to actually draft those terms and conditions. For a lower risk type application, say for your standard CRM type application, you would then say to yourself, I know that this is low risk. Do I really care that the terms and conditions don't truly reflect what the cloud situation? Does it matter? So does it matter if it goes down for a little while? Do I need an SLA for this particular application? Whereas in the critical one, then you really would need to pin down those SLAs and talk about restitution. And I think we were talking earlier about the example where a $200 a month service goes down and causes the company $1 million loss. So you need to go back and decide whether it was appropriate to put that into the cloud in the first place, given what we know about that.
Yeah, I guess the whole concept of restitution compensation, is a difficult one, because a lot of the service providers would say, well, hang on, we're relying on ISPs and telcos, and so we're not going to carry any of that sort of liability. So do you think that that's just never going to go anywhere?
If it's a very critical situation, so if you, for example, are running a trading room software operation from the cloud, I would recommend that before you did that, then you would say to the vendor in a specific situation, yes, it is important. So I would want to know, for example, what's going on inside the cloud, what the peering arrangements are, what the contention ratios are at either end, what bandwidth is available, what the restoration times are with your service providers, and each of those you can put an SLA around. If you can measure it, then you can design restitution. But generally, restitution in this situation only works if you're prepaying for a service and you have the ability to withhold it. If you're talking about the $1 million loss, then that's a completely different contractual situation where there is perhaps a breach of that contract, and then you litigate it. That is something that hasn't been tried yet, hasn't been tested. It would potentially be possible, but the loss would have to be sort of relatively big to actually get to the stage where you wanted that tested, or even to try and prevent that in a contract before you got to that stage.
It sounds like that, particularly given that criticality, that we're seeing that a lot of enterprise adoption of cloud has been around dev, test, websites, as you say, CRM. It seems to, from our data, it seems to be slowing in the sense of moving large-scale enterprise applications. But there's a reason, because as you say, if the legal framework hasn't really been invented yet, yeah, that's a big hurdle.
Yeah, it's that, and also, as I'm sure people are mostly familiar with, the issues of confidentiality, security, data sovereignty. So, for example, if you're a government department, or if you're a large corporation, it's all very well to put your data into the cloud. An issue arises in terms of what happens to that when you scale down or up. Firstly. Second issue arises in terms of interoperability between your different applications. All of those things can be contractually and legally dealt with, but it's not something you can do tomorrow. You need to really think about and understand and do proper due diligence on, and make a risk-based decision about whether you do it or not.
So there's a sense then that, from what I'm hearing, is that your take on the current maturity of the legal frameworks that support the Australian cloud computing market, fairly low?
Oh, absolutely, very low. The reason being is that, number one, it's expensive to hire a lawyer to do that. Number two, the actual knowledge of people in the field to have the knowledge to be able to do that, to even ask the right questions, is just starting to increase from a very, very low base. So, yeah, the maturity model is very low.
So we talked earlier about risk, and we talked about SLAs and availability and those sorts of things, and scalability up and down. And you briefly touched on sovereignty, data sovereignty. So the CRM system, as an example, with customer data in the cloud, deemed to be low risk perhaps from an availability point of view, but with the Australian privacy provisions being altered this year, and there's been a lot of talk about offshore data, surely the ability for the vendors to comply with all state and territory and federal government provisions is going to become more of an issue. Is that correct? I mean,
absolutely.
The client data and the client having their rights, saying, well, why was my data hacked? What's the vulnerability? I mean, there's an accountability there.
There is. There's a couple of things depending on whether you're a vendor or whether you're a customer. So, as you say, there are now and soon to be more onerous conditions on anybody who collects what's known as personal information, and how they collect it, they store it, and what they do with it. It is possible to, if you like, gain the consent of the person that you're collecting that data from, and if you use the right framework, particularly the right legal framework, it's possible, if you're a vendor, to cover your risk contractually. It's, again, something which is not at a very high level of maturity, but it can be done. If you're a customer, then you're concerned about where your data is, personal information is going to be held. And again, you can deal with that in a contractual way. It's a matter of balancing the two sides against each other in a way that complies with the rules and the laws. So really it is again a question of maturity, whether that maturity exists and whether somebody's prepared to pay for somebody to do it is another thing.
Finally, I just wanted to talk about a lot of boards when they're assessing, you know, a business case to move infrastructure to a cloud provider, particularly if it's a smaller cloud provider. Often it comes up at vendor risk, so vendor, you know, sustainability and those kind of things. So can we talk about step-in rights and how
Sure.
that's achievable in a shared environment, which it sounds like it just would be almost a nightmare to deal with?
Well, I've seen a cloud services contract where one of the provisions was that at regular intervals, the cloud vendor had to deposit in an escrow type of arrangement all of the technology required for the customer to be able to recreate the environment on premise. So a local copy of the application plus the data. Again, that's an expensive mitigation, but it's a possible way of doing it. It is possible to do. It's just that it's expensive, and again, it's a contractual issue.
It sounds also to me that it would be potentially be a lot of downtime in recreating that environment if something happened.
Yes, yes. Again, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the criticality of the data. If it's absolutely super critical, then you would be justified in spending money to ensure that it's available. Other things that people do that I've seen are replication locally. So if the data is held overseas, then it's replicated locally. And regular effective restoration type exercises. Going back to the contractual side in terms of step-in rights, the question generally arises as to, number one, who's going to pay for it? Number two, how long the period of step-in lasts? Number three, who has what rights during that step-in? So obviously the vendor will want to understand what it has to do for you to step back out. And finally, that step back out process, whether it happens or whether the customer continues to provide the service itself or gets a third party back in. So again, that's another contractual arrangement which needs to be put in, or can be put in place, a matter of time and cost and risk.
So what needs to happen then, do you think? What would you like to see happening? I mean, we all talk about cloud computing standards and...
Yes.
So is that where this needs to go, and who's going to drive that from a legal perspective?
All of those things in terms of interoperability, in terms of standards, are an IT-driven process. And if we go back to the early days of on-premise software development, similar issues occurred. So from the legal point of view, it's the early adopters need to really, at this point in time, almost get a specific contract done for each particular circumstance. That will change over time as standard type contracts emerge. So we're seeing it now in terms of what vendors are prepared to offer in terms of SLAs. And if you compare across different types of vendors, which I've seen a few of, they're generally similar. So those standard type contracts will emerge. It's just that they're not at a very sort of high maturity level right now.
So there's a possibility that there could be a competitive differentiation for a vendor if they're prepared to invest heavily in a robust legal framework to improve the standard and maturity of the offering.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks, Bill. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.